An empire on fire and plundered by rampaging hordes, weak emperors in both East and West. One man held the destiny of Rome in his hand and protected it in the traditions of the finest generals in its history, sacrificing himself in its name. But history has traditionally cast him as the first of the men who would eventually destroy Rome. How is it that Stilicho was both the savior and beginning of the end of the world's largest empire? He who once turned the soil with 100 plows now labors to have just a pair of oxen. The man who often rode through splendid cities in his carriages now is sick and travels to the deserted countryside, wearily and on foot. Neither country nor city is as it was. Everything rushes headlong to its end. So wrote the Roman poet and theologian Prosper of Aquitaine in the early years of the 5th century AD, the period in which the Roman Empire in Western Europe began its disintegration. One of the foremost figures of this critical era was a half-Roman and half-barbarian Vandal general named Stilicho. Stilicho led the armies of the Western Empire successfully for more than 10 years, fending off Roman usurpers and Germanic invasions and holding the increasingly shaky edifice of the Roman government together in the loyal service of his emperor Honorius. In spite of his victories and undeniable capability, or perhaps because of them, Stilicho was accused of treachery and executed in 408 AD. The Visigothic capture and sack of Rome followed 2 years later, almost to the day, the first time the city which conquered the Mediterranean had fallen to a foreign general in 800 years. Though he was not the first commander in the empire to come from a non-Roman background, Stilicho operated from within its very highest echelons, the imperial family itself. Before we explore the dangerous and uncertain world of the late Roman Empire, if you're interested in early access to videos and live chats with the creator of Intrigued Mind, consider subscribing to our Patreon. Your support will greatly help us keep the channel producing more intriguing content. It is known that Stilicho was the son of a Vandal cavalry officer and a Roman mother. Stilicho's father likely held a high rank in the Roman army, as Stilicho led an embassy to the Persian King of Kings Shapur III in 383 while still only in his 20s. This embassy was successful because in the following decade, Stilicho was promoted until he reached the rank of Magister Militum, equivalent to general in the modern usage. In addition to that honor, the Emperor Theodosius also allowed Stilicho to marry his niece, Serena, thus making him a member of the imperial family. The marriage was lasting, and Stilicho and Serena had a son, Eucharius. The short-lived unity and stability of Theodosius's reign ended with his death in 395, and the Roman Empire was divided between his sons Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. The British historian Edward Gibbon records that the generals and counselors of Theodosius served his sons Honorius and Arcadius loyally, seeing them as the embodiment of the greatness of their father. Unfortunately, neither son seemed to inherit Theodosius's wisdom or ability. Instead, they relied on generals like Stilicho to protect their reigns. Pledged to Honorius and the West, Stilicho was forced to provide this support and protection from the very moment of Theodosius's passing. The Visigoth tribe, who had been settled in the Balkans for the past decade and a half, immediately rebelled on Theodosius's death under their leader, Alaric. At the same moment, on the far eastern border, the Huns began a concerted attack on Roman provinces south of the Caucasus Mountains, invading Armenia. This Hunnic invasion limited the Eastern Roman response to Alaric, but Stilicho committed his army and moved against the Visigoths. Linking up with a force from the east, Stilicho encircled Alaric and his Goths and was poised to destroy them. But reluctant to allow the Western leader a crushing victory, the Eastern troops were withdrawn, and Stilicho was ordered to leave the territory. Obeying the command, Stilicho had to watch as Alaric was given favorable terms by the Eastern Empire and allowed to rule his people independently within Roman borders. Stilicho returned to the west and stabilized Gaul over the next 2 years, meeting a renewed assault by Alaric in 397. Another opportunity to destroy the Visigoths was snatched away by a rebellion in Africa, and Stilicho was forced to turn his attention to that vital province. The African situation was brought under control within a year, forestalling a famine in the still massive city of Rome. But this run of events became the pattern for the remainder of Stilicho's life. Stilicho spent his time as the ruler in all but name of the Western Empire, fighting one threat only for another to appear in a different area and require the diversion of his shrinking resources. Stilicho next went north to repel an invasion of Vandals and Alans, and again, Alaric sensed weakness and invaded Italy. The Emperor Honorius was unable to fight the Visigoths himself, and Alaric put him under siege at Milan. Showing tremendous ability, Stilicho crossed the Alps and lifted the siege, defeating Alaric 3 times in battle and sending him back to the eastern-controlled Balkans. An arc of triumph was raised in Rome to Stilicho and Honorius, but there was no time to rest on his laurels, for a new invasion of allied barbarian tribes under a Goth named Radagaisus crossed from the north into Italy. Stilicho was so outnumbered that he promised freedom to slaves and gladiators if they joined his improvised army of mixed Romans and barbarian allies to engage the invaders, who were said to number 100,000. With 20,000 men, Stilicho defeated Radagaisus, killing him in battle, and then recruited 12,000 of Radagaisus's men into his own army. It was a small comfort, as the reduction of troop numbers from the defenses of the northern Rhine allowed yet another invasion of tribes to cross there in 406, with the only opposition in strength coming from the Roman allied Franks. This latest force of Vandals, Alans, and Suevi began pillaging Roman farms, villages, and towns. The plundering broke the resolve of the Roman authorities in northern Gaul and Britain, and they elected their own emperor by the name of Constantine III to replace Honorius. Still loyal to Honorius, Stilicho sent a force to delay Constantine while he attempted to raise fresh troops. Even with perhaps 30,000 men in his army, Stilicho was unable to face both Constantine and the barbarian invasion simultaneously. Stilicho even entered negotiations with Alaric to enroll his experienced Visigothic army into the Western Empire's service, giving him access also to the manpower of Illyria, where Alaric had his base. This policy created tension with the court of the Eastern Empire in Constantinople, as these regions were under their jurisdiction, not Stilicho's. Stilicho promised Alaric payments for his service, and when he was unable to make these in time due to the worsening situation in Gaul and a civil war with Constantine, Alaric yet again marched on Italy. Now faced with 3 enemies at once, Stilicho had to compel the Roman Senate to pay Alaric what was in effect a bribe, a highly unpopular action given Alaric's past affronts. Alaric received his money and withdrew, and Stilicho, with his still considerable army of mixed Romans and loyal barbarians, made ready to destroy Constantine, who was now at the outskirts of Italy. Unfortunately for Stilicho and the empire, it never happened. Emboldened by Stilicho's loss of support from the political class, along with that of the Eastern Empire, counselors at the court convinced Honorius that Stilicho had been conspiring with Alaric to make himself emperor, and they moved against Stilicho in a secret coup. Stilicho's commanders were murdered, and the families of Stilicho's barbarian soldiers were massacred throughout Italy. Stilicho himself, when he realized what was happening, chose to go quietly and face execution, rather than fight and bring even more ruin on the now crumbling Western Empire. His barbarian troops, enraged at the murder of their families, transferred their allegiance to Alaric, and a terrible war of revenge was wrought on the Romans who had betrayed them. 2 years later, Alaric sacked Rome itself, and within a generation, the empire in the West had ceased to be a functional unit governed by the central authority in the person of the emperor, divided instead amongst the barbarian rulers that Stilicho had attempted to drive from its borders. With the benefit of hindsight, Stilicho was certainly a forerunner for other, more brutal barbarian generals to wield power from behind the throne over the next 7 decades. But every serious historian of this period, from Edward Gibbon to Peter Heather, are unanimous in their praise for Stilicho's character and ability. Gibbon said of him, "The celestial gift which Achilles obtained and Alexander envied has been enjoyed by Stilicho in a much higher degree than might have been expected from the declining state of genius and of art." Stilicho's contemporaries are also notable in their praise of him. The late pagan Quintus Aurelius Symmachus, perhaps the greatest Roman historian of the 4th century and one of its most successful career politicians, was a friend and ally of Stilicho and worked with him to restore some of the legislative powers of the Roman Senate, painting Stilicho decidedly not as an autocrat or religious fanatic. The Christian historian and theologian Paulus Orosius was unequivocal in his criticism of Stilicho as a barbarian usurper, but he explicitly states Stilicho sought the imperial throne not for himself, but for his son, Eucharius. Given that Stilicho served the incapable Honorius, who never produced an heir, and that Eucharius was a blood member of the imperial family through his mother and thus a good candidate for the throne, Paulus's charges are not devastating given the fraught future of the Roman Empire at the time. Claudius Claudianus, another Christian writer and theologian, was outright in his praise of Stilicho as the greatest man of his age, and Stilicho's death as perhaps the greatest calamity to befall the empire during the period. In what could serve as a worthy epitaph, as well as a conclusion to this video, he described the high point of Stilicho's career thus: "Behold, O Rome, the hero whose presence the cries of thy people and the voice of thy nobles has long demanded. No further shall uncertainty torment thee. Honor thou the consul, who has restored its dignity to the consulship. Welcome the noble heart that directs the reins of empire and secures by its providence the equipoise of the world. Behold the warrior, successful in every field, the defender of Africa, the conqueror of Rhine and Danube." For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel, like the video, and leave your suggestions in the comments below.